Long before we had Google Maps, or, even a complete map of the planet, two superpowers did something, well, kind of audacious. They decided to split the entire world between just the two of them.
I mean, really think about that for a second. How do you divide a planet you haven't even fully discovered yet? It sounds completely absurd to us now, right? But back in the late 15th century, for two powerful empires, this was a very real, very urgent problem they had to solve.
And their answer? Deceptively simple. The two great naval powers of the day, Spain and Portugal, decided they would just draw a line. A single, imaginary line on a map that would, no big deal, change the entire course of history.
So, let's dive in. Our story really kicks off not with a peaceful agreement, but with a full-blown crisis, one that threatened to completely upend the world order and push two nations to the absolute brink of war.
So picture it. March 1493. Christopher Columbus is sailing back from his groundbreaking voyage for Spain. But he doesn't go straight home. His first stop is Lisbon, the capital of Spain's biggest rival. He basically strolls into the Portuguese king's court and announces he's found a new route to the Indies.
You can imagine how well that went over. The Portuguese king was furious. He says, "Hold on a minute. Those new lands you found, they belong to us based on a treaty we already have." So tensions just skyrocket. Portugal starts getting a fleet ready to go seize those territories by force, and boom, the race to claim the New World was officially on.
So, you might be wondering, why was Portugal so confident? To understand that, we've got to rewind a little. You see, for decades, they'd been the masters of Atlantic exploration, and they had already drawn their own line on the map.
For nearly 100 years, Portugal had been methodically, painstakingly pushing down the coast of Africa. They conquered Ceuta, they sailed past the legendary barrier of Cape Jojador, and finally, Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving a sea route to the east was actually possible. They had poured blood and treasure into this.
And here's the key. The Treaty of Alcáçovas from 1479. It drew a horizontal line just south of the Canary Islands. Anything discovered south of that line belonged to Portugal, period. So when Columbus shows up talking about new lands to the southwest, Portugal saw it as a direct violation of their turf.
Okay, so Spain's in a really tough spot. They're facing down a powerful Portuguese fleet, an illegally binding treaty. They needed a game changer. So they went over the king's head and appealed to an even higher authority. They went to the Pope. And, what a coincidence, the Pope at the time, Alexander VI, just happened to be Spanish. So Spain pleaded its case, and the Pope, who really needed Spain's political support, was more than happy to listen.
So in 1493, the Pope issues a formal decree, a papal bull, called Inter Caetera. The language is just staggering. He wasn't just mediating, he was claiming the authority to give away entire continents that Europeans hadn't even seen yet, assigning them to Spain forever.
The Pope's solution completely upended the old agreement. He just ignored that horizontal line and drew a brand new vertical line, running from the North Pole to the South Pole. This single act completely rewrote the rules for building an empire.
But Portugal wasn't about to let a Spanish pope dictate the fate of their century-long imperial project. No way. They rejected the pope's decree and forced Spain to come to the negotiating table for a final, binding deal.
Portugal basically called the Pope's line a biased sham. They ignored his decree, kept their warships ready to sail, and insisted on direct, face-to-face negotiations with Spain. It was an incredibly high-stakes diplomatic standoff.
And you know what? Portugal's hardball strategy worked. The Pope's original line was only 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, which gave almost everything to Spain. But in the negotiations, Portugal managed to push that line all the way out to 370 leagues. It might not seem like much on a map, but that shift was a massive diplomatic victory.
This new agreement became the famous Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494. It made that vertical line official. Everything east of the line was Portugal's sphere, that's Africa, and the route to India. Everything west of it was Spain's, all the lands of the Americas.
So why did Portugal fight so hard to move that line? Well, just 6 years later, in 1500, a Portuguese fleet supposedly heading to India swings way out into the Atlantic and lands on the coast of Brazil. And thanks to their tough negotiations, this huge new territory was squarely on Portugal's side of the line. Coincidence? Let's just say a lot of historians suspect the Portuguese already knew it was there.
So the Atlantic was divided. Problem solved, right? Not exactly.
The treaty had a huge, globe-spanning flaw that would actually spark the next great age of exploration.
In solving the crisis in the Atlantic, they had created a far bigger and far more valuable problem on the other side of the planet.
The treaty sliced the Atlantic neatly in two, but it raised a new, massive question. Where did that line fall on the other side of the world? When you got to the Pacific, nobody knew for sure.
This ambiguity was a huge deal. The treaty never defined the line on the far side of the globe, and lying right in that gray area were the fabulously wealthy Spice Islands. So, a new race began. Portugal sailed east, Spain sailed west, each trying to prove the islands were on their side of the line. And this is exactly what motivated Ferdinand Magellan's quest to circumnavigate the globe.
And this leaves us with one final thought. The Treaty of Tordesillas was an agreement between two powers, dividing up lands they'd never even seen, completely disregarding the millions of people who already called those places home. It really forces us to ask, when a line is drawn on a map, who truly wins and who is forced to lose?